In the months since a West Springfield truck driver crashed into a group of motorcycle riders in New Hampshire, killing 7, we've been learning more about the driver, 23-year-old Volodymyr Zhukovsky. We now know he was on drugs and was reaching for a drink at the time of the crash. But the big question remains, why was he behind the wheel at all? After a series of alerts, including a failed sobriety test, during which he apparently made suicidal comments and showed extreme behavior. But alerts about Zhukovsky's out-of-state infractions and those of thousands of others sat unprocessed for months. To make matters worse, in a hearing before the state legislature this week, an RMV auditor said she had told key agency officials, including the now former registrar, Aaron Devaney, about those alerts 3 months before the fatal crash. But in her testimony, Devaney said the agency hasn't processed those kinds of out-of-state alerts in nearly 20 years.
Since my first employment with the Registry of Motor Vehicles in September of 2000, I am not aware of any prior effort to process and enter paper violations that were received by the Registry of Motor Vehicles regarding out-of-state violations.
That auditor testified that she told the man who ran the department in charge of the unprocessed alerts, Thomas Bowes, about the issue. He's the guy who stayed on vacation in London as the story was breaking and is now facing calls to resign. When asked who was responsible for sorting through the documents, here's how he apparently responded.
So I had asked who was in charge of those, and he stated nobody.
Nobody. As for the man at the top, Governor Charlie Baker.
I was first made aware of the discrepancy on this on the day that the registrar resigned.
The chairs of the state's transportation committee leading the investigation, Senator Joseph Boncory and Representative William Strauss, join me now. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Sure, I start with you. Last time you were here, you were occupied at the State House. You were, I think, pretty upset about the virtual non-cooperation of the Baker administration in terms of witnesses and documents. This time was a whole different story. What changed? What happened?
Well, I think the public got a chance to be engaged, and in whatever ways they expressed their views to the administration, made it clear that they thought the legislature, as we asserted, had a legitimate role in finding out what was going on. While they proceeded with their own investigations, we had a right to do so as well.
Let's get to the merits of this thing as best we can. Senator, how long do people at the registry know that these paper notifications, like the one saying that Zhukovsky had been driving drunk in Connecticut, how long have they gone unprocessed?
You know, that was unclear as we started this oversight. It became a little more clear that people knew, and directors within the agency began to talk about it in about 2016. Whether or not people knew, and it's seemingly possible that people knew like long before that this was an issue.
Do you remember what your reaction was when you heard when you heard the auditor mention that Thomas Bowes said to her when she asked who was in charge, and his response was allegedly one word, nobody? Do you remember what you were thinking at the time?
Oftentimes during that hearing, in interviewing the directors of certain agencies in the registry, my mouth was agape, and I couldn't believe the answers that were coming out of it.
You know, I want to get back to Devaney in a couple of minutes. I mispronounced her name. My apologies. Here's Governor Baker at a press conference yesterday. I just want to play this, please.
What seems really incredible to me is that for over 20 years, Massachusetts was not, outside of the CDL process, which seems pretty well locked and relatively solid, that nobody was doing this stuff for over 20 years. That part is absolutely incredible to me.
I have to say, I'm not even clear what he means. I don't mean this out of disrespect to him. What didn't happen for 20 years, and is he right that it didn't happen for 20 years?
It's very hard to keep focus on here, but I think the one way to analyze the discussions is keep track of the paper that was going unread, keep track of the computer messages that were going unread. The auditor, what she identified, and in our modern age is the more disturbing right now to me, that is the 13,000 electronic messages that were just sitting in a computer email box.
And they had come in over what period of time?
Those had come in at least over a year and a half and maybe more.
You know, I want to also I want to put this in context because I worry that when people are listening to what you've had to say and when I've talked about a lot this week, you know, it's sort of we're talking about one bureaucratic screw up like so many that happen in a big government. But here is, again, the former registrar talking about the families of the 7 people who were killed. Here she is.
In the midst of all of this, 7 families experienced an unimaginable tragedy. And they didn't deserve explanations or excuses. They deserve to have someone be accountable and acknowledge that the service that the Registry of Motor Vehicles provided was unacceptable in this instance. And for that reason, I tendered my resignation.
You know, I want to talk to you about accountability in a minute, but I have to say my head has almost exploded this week, and I don't even have anywhere near the responsibility you do. Is it unfair to say, Senator, that 7 people would likely be alive if people had performed the responsibilities they were charged with performing at the registry? Is that an unfair statement?
It's not an unfair statement. If paper were processed, in the way it should have been, and there was some responsibility in people doing this work, and the registry had the manpower to have the people do the work, then, these people who are deceased now, things might have been different.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with it, and I will say at that moment, a certain amount of respect obviously goes to her for acknowledging her own responsibility. But I remember very well Representative Tucker then asking the secretary later in the day, one person has accepted responsibility and resigned. Is there anyone else who should be held accountable for this? And her questions were essentially, in my view, no. No one else has stepped forward. Again, you have to respect what she did, but our sense right now, and we have more work to do, is there's more information out there, and it's hard to believe that this was contained just within the Registry of Motor Vehicles.
Well, I was going to get to that in a minute, but since you did, let me stay on that a minute. The governor said that the first time he heard of this was when the registrar resigned. Assume the Secretary of Transportation, Stephanie Pollack, is saying she didn't know about it either. The Speaker of the House, DeLeo, said, and I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close from the Globe, that all this raised questions about higher-ups and how far did it go. So how far did it go, based on your hearings? Do you know?
We don't know yet, but we intend to find out.
Do you believe that it ended with the registrar or her underling, this guy that stayed in London for a week when this whole thing broke? Do you buy that?
There are a lot of conflicting stories, I think, that we were told the other day during the testimony, and there were memorandums that were written to people higher up that apparently never got to the people higher up. As you put it.
But are you? That one of the memoranda was this fall 2016 letter, apparently, to the Department of Transportation General Counsel and to the General Counsel, the governor, and they say they never got this. Do we have? Is this credible to you two gentlemen?
I have no reason to believe anyone would come before a standing committee of the legislature and lie. But we're going to begin to, inquire further as to why this wasn't delivered or why it wasn't acted on and who knew about it.
So you're not convinced yet, I don't want to put words in your mouth, surely, you're not convinced yet, in answer to the Speaker's question, that it does end at the registrar level. Is that correct?
Not only am I not convinced, but an additional email surfaced in the public record in one of the Boston newspapers today, an email that has not been provided to us, and we still don't have a complete response yet from the administration, but that indicates that alerts went to the governor's office, the Division of Insurance, and the Attorney General's office that the workload was not being met as early as May 2016.
I mean, they didn't have the person power, the staffing, to do the job that they needed to do.
Yes, and this occurred at a time 5 months before an additional workload was dumped on them.
Why wasn't that provided to you when you requested documents? Do you know, either of you?
I don't think we're the best people to answer that question.
Why do you speculate as why it wasn't provided? Because a lot of documents were provided this second round, correct?
We did receive a lot of emails. We don't know if it's an inclusive to the list that we asked for to be provided with. We heard some stuff will continue to come in.
Why do you think you didn't get it? Because it's damaging? Is that what your look on your face is suggesting?
Well, I will say this. That most damaging audit report came to us at 7 minutes before 5 the day before the hearing.
That audit report from that woman there. Speaking of documents, what documents that you did get? I know you can't go down the whole list. You've posted them. Mm-hmm. I have one here, and I have a feeling, well, you tell me, what was of most concern for you when you first got to see what they unloaded for you?
the variety of ways, frankly, that the agency was not functioning. It wasn't functioning in terms of its paperwork. It wasn't functioning in terms of its computer work. And the letter that was entered probably at a later stage, where a private citizen, a psychologist, wrote directly to the registrar saying, there are people I know in Massachusetts who should not have their driver's licenses.
Can I read this, and then I'd like to hear your response too, Senator? It's to Registrar Devaney. Again, my apologies for the mispronunciation. I'm a psychologist, and then blank in blank, who has specialized in treating addictions for the past 30 years. I'm alerting you to a problem where my Massachusetts patients who have had DWIs and driving while under the influence in New Hampshire not having their Mass license revoked. They have always, in capital letters, been revoked in the past, but there's been a change for the last 8 months, or roughly since the new licenses have been instituted. This is a dangerous situation. I've called the registry, sent emails, no response. This is a serious problem, as I have many people driving in Massachusetts without penalty or caution. Please advise me if there has been a change in law. This is April 29th, 2019. And while the governor talks about how some of the problems may go back as much as 20 years, this is a problem that obviously is brand new, if the psychologist is to be believed, because she said in the past she always got a response and the licenses were acted upon. Here she couldn't even get a response to her communication. Is that an accurate statement?
That's an accurate statement. We were provided that. We were also provided with many documents that were, interagency documents that said, we have a backlog here, and this is back in 2016, of either 10,000 or 100,000 notifications that have been unprocessed, and we know this is a big public safety issue and puts people's lives in peril. And that went up the chain, and certain people saw it, and certain people said they didn't see it. But for them to identify it as a public safety issue, putting lives in peril, and for no action to be taken, is just negligent.
And I would add, even if the information didn't go beyond the Registry of Motor Vehicles, it should have.
You sent a letter jointly, gentlemen, I believe, to Secretary Pollock saying, please preserve all your documents. And I read a quote from you saying, Chairman Strauss, you had never written a letter like that in the decade that you've been chairing committees. What did you mean by saying you've never written a letter like that?
I think it's the personal impact that all of us feel about the tragedy that brought us here. And to know that there may be information out there that's so important. I felt, and my co-chair felt when we wrote that letter, that we had to state in the most unequivocal terms, there are records out there that are important for people to find out what happened, and do not make them or allow them to go away.
Were you worried that they would go away? Is that why you wrote the letter?
I think it's just a prudent action on our part to make it clear how important, how serious we are about this.
Were you worried about the security of those documents, Senator?
I think it's important that those documents are preserved, and as we continue on this oversight, that we have access, and the public really has access to what happened here.
Can you tell, obviously this is far from done based on what you're saying here and what you've said publicly elsewhere. Tell me the 2 or 3 things that are at the top of your list, Senator, of questions that are unanswered that you think the public has a right to know the answer to.
Right. I think we need to find out what the Grant Thornton audit is going to say.
That's the private audit commissioned by the Department of Transportation.
Yeah, so at this point, we'll be waiting on that. The chairman and I are still talking about next steps and talking with leadership about next steps. But questions do remain unanswered as to why certain functions weren't taking place at the registry, why people were saying, process this before processing that, why notifications weren't going out to other states, and what our negligence is there as a state, and ultimately, where the responsibility lies and who knew about this.
And I assume the central question we've asked in has been asked many investigations, as I said at the top, who knew what and when is really the centerpiece, and you're not really prepared quite yet to answer all those questions, right?
No, the reason I'm not prepared to answer those is we knew some of the things that we were intending to have enter the public record on Tuesday, but I think what was most surprising to me was acknowledgments in the testimony of things I didn't see coming. So our search should allow more information to get out there, and we're going to be persistent at this because that's not only what the public wants, that's what our colleagues want, and I think it's in the public interest.
Would you have, well, in 30 seconds, do you both have confidence from this point forward you'll have the full cooperation of the Baker administration?
I think so, but we have made it clear we will take whatever steps it takes to get that information.
You're nodding in agreement.
Yes, I am.
Senator, thank you.
Thank you.
Representative, thank you. And thanks for the work you're doing. I'm sure the
Sure,
families
absolutely.
feel the same way. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. And as I said to you yesterday, we extended invitations to every one of the public officials who testified on Tuesday to join us. And a state transportation department spokesperson told us that all declined our invitation.